What would happen if you built a refuge for a persecuted people in a place where another people already lived?
The Palestinian struggle is not just a cry for justice. It's a blistering battle for the most fundamental human rights that every living soul on this planet should inherit by birthright. It's an unyielding resistance against the oppressive, suffocating grip of occupation and the callous denial of the most basic human dignity. Just as the civil rights movement in the United States fought against the chains of racial discrimination, so too do the Palestinian people strive to shatter the chains of occupation and tyranny. Never forget, my friends, that the Palestinians, much like African Americans in the United States, have been subjected to a heart-wrenching history of suffering and torment. The birth of Israel in 1948 brought forth the mass expulsion and dispossession of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their ancestral homes and land. This is a historic injustice that continues to haunt the lives of Palestinians to this very day. The situation in Palestine serves as a brutal reminder of the consequences of colonialism and the ruthless dispossession of indigenous people. It is an agonizing reminder that the fight for justice knows no borders, and we must stand united in solidarity with all oppressed peoples, whether they reside in the United States, South Africa, or anywhere around the world. Let's be unequivocally clear. Advocating for the rights of the Palestinian people is not synonymous with denying the rights and security of the Jewish people. The fight for justice in Palestine is not an assault on any particular group, but an unwavering stand against the policies of a Zionist state that has for far too long stripped Palestinians of their rights. We must remember that numerous Jewish voices also resound in the calls for justice and peace in Palestine, and their voices must not be silenced. In our relentless pursuit of justice for the Palestinian people, we must also acknowledge that it is in the best interest of the entire world to seek a just and enduring solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is a pursuit in the name of peace, stability, and the dignity of all mankind. But let me underscore this. The battle for justice in Palestine is not merely a political struggle, it's an elemental moral battle. It's the fight for the most basic human rights of a people who have suffered these injustices for far too long. It's the fight for the right to exist in peace and security, free from the ceaseless specter of violence and dispossession. If you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing. I implore every person of conscience, regardless of their origins or beliefs, to stand steadfast with the Palestinian people in their unwavering quest for justice by any means necessary. Let us unite in building a world where every soul can live in freedom and dignity, where the rights of every individual are not just respected, but celebrated. The struggle for justice in Palestine is a universal fight, a resonating echo of the battles waged by oppressed people across the globe. It's a battle we must champion, a torch we must carry, and a legacy we must honor. Thank you, and free Palestine.
We're in a religious war here. I am with Israel. Do whatever the hell you have to do to defend yourself. Level the place.
We're looking at Israeli propaganda.
Israel says.
The Israeli lies are continuous and incessant, and the ultimate proof of that is that they will not allow the evidence which would be counter to their argument to be released. They control all of the evidence that's being released.
The Israeli soldiers are being attacked, and their argument is they were only acting in self-defense.
Sure.
Israel's argument, as you know, is always that it is unfair, that they...
And you know what the problem is with that argument? Really? Where's the proof? What, from Israel? They're lying. They lie incessantly.
Are the soldiers who were wounded lying?
That they are telling the truth?
What? Because you were involved in this.
Where's the video footage of shooting Israeli soldiers?
I'm interviewing you because you
I had a
involved.
pistol in my hand. I had a 9mm pistol in my hand. I'm an ex-Marine. I've been in combat. I've served in a war situation. If I wanted to kill an Israeli soldier, I can guarantee you he would be dead right now.
They are trying to defend their right to exist. That is why their argument is it's self-defense.
And if you believe that, then I've got some swampland in Florida to sell you as well. So, if you ask me, do I believe Israel
rubbish.
when it repeats its lies? No, I don't believe Israel. They are lying consistently, and anybody with their eyes open can see that. It's like America saying it wants peace, yet conducting state-sponsored terrorism in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's a lie. Israel is lying. They don't want peace.
Are they
because
lying when they
peace-
say there was no
peace
humanitarian
for
aid
Israel
on the
to
ship?
them and the Zionist agenda is the end of the Zionist project. They don't want peace. It's a lie.
So I think people thought I was joking when I said, hey, that's just a line from the Zionist playbook. But there's actually a Zionist playbook. It was published in 2009 to help people defend the atrocities of Israel. And if you don't believe me, you could just type in that title, The Israel Project, and you could download the 116-page document. It even has a table of contents, rules for effective communication, glossary of words that work, how to talk about Palestine's self-government and prosperity, isolating Iran-backed Hamas as an obstacle to peace, Israel's right to self-defense and defensible borders. Do you ever wonder why everyone sounds the same when they're talking about Israel? There's no second opinion? It's because it's literally written out for them. This is 18 chapters. So here, this is like chapter 1, the 25 rules for effective communication. And the first point is, it doesn't matter if you know, you need to show the other side you care. So they're telling people to fake caring. So persuadables won't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Show empathy for both sides. So this is like a tactic that they tell people to do. It's weird that they have to write it out.
In 2009, the Israel Project turned to conservative pollster and rebranding expert Frank Luntz.
Frank Luntz. This is the man that reframed the estate tax as the death tax, healthcare reform as government takeover of healthcare. Now, some critics have called Luntz a spin doctor who manipulates public emotion, but Luntz would reframe that as Fox News analyst.
The Israel Project hired him to determine which talking points used by Israeli and US officials over time have been most effective in maintaining American sympathy for Israel. Luntz wrote up his recommendations in a 2009 report called The Global Language Dictionary.
If you want to understand how the propaganda works, especially in the US, you need to read the Luntz document. He's really clear that the occupation and especially the settlements are a problem. And he points to polls that show a large majority of Americans actually think that Israel should retreat to the 67 borders. In fact, he says, when you talk about land in terms of 67, you completely flip American sentiment against you. But, and this is his solution, if you bring up the danger of terrorism, you win back the support.
So this was nice too. Things not to say. We are prepared to allow them to build. Don't use that. Don't use that. We allow them to build. Even though that's what they're doing, they're saying don't use it. Try this one. Achieving peaceful relations requires the leadership, political, business, and military of both sides. And so we asked the Palestinians, stop using that language of incitement, stop using the language of violence. And, they're trying to turn it back on the Palestinians, but this is a script. So when I say this is a Zionist line or from the playbook, because it literally is from the playbook.
The key, Luntz says, is the claim that the fight is over ideology, not land, about terror, not territory. In fact, these three words, terror, not territory, summarize the basis of the propaganda campaign in the US. If you want to see this in operation, just look at the coverage of any of Israel's many attacks on Gaza over the past few years.
Israel has the right to defend itself against Hamas, of course, a group that is firing rockets on Israel, coming out of tunnels to attack Israelis.
Any advertising executive will tell you the essence of propaganda is repetition.
Like, amazing that this isn't, exposed yet, but how can the current Palestinian leadership honestly say it will pursue peace when previous leaders rejected an offer? You always hear that. What about the offers that were rejected? It came from here. This is still chapter 1, I think, page whatever. But how do I make peace with a government who wants me dead? Why are they phrasing it like that? You ever wonder why they phrase it like that? Because they're told to phrase it like this. I heard Piers Morgan use one of these in his interview with Sinek. And he said that's a weird way to phrase the question. It's an unfair way to phrase the question. And this is why. Because he got it from the playbook. It's right here. Here are the questions you're going to hear a lot, time and time again, because it is scripted for them.
I do not stand by anyone or any institution that violates human rights. However,
Do
what
you
I will
accept that
say,
Hamas does?
yes, I do, and I will say absolutely 100%, without reservation, I support the right of self-defense without any doubt. I would be involved myself in violent resistance if I were a citizen of Palestine or Iraq or Afghanistan. And if I were a citizen of the United States or Britain and someone from halfway around the world came into my country and started stealing my land and killing my family, guess what? I would defend my country as well. So, I absolutely 100% defend the right of self-defense, and I will never shy away from that. I will not join the long list of embarrassments who condemn terrorism while forgetting to acknowledge that the biggest terrorist on the planet is the United States government for all of its terrorism around the world.
Do you accept that Israel has a right to defend itself?
Absolutely, every country does, and that's exactly why the hypocrisy and the lies of Israel are so transparent. Are you telling me we don't have the right to defend ourselves? When I saw dead bodies on that ship and we were hitting people with bars and sticks, we don't have the right to defend ourselves, but they do they?
Hamas doesn't recognize the right of Israel to exist.
You know what that sounds like to me? That sounds like the African National Congress and Nelson Mandela refusing to accept apartheid and recognize apartheid. I say that Israel, if it wants to be a genuine partner in any kind of peace, needs to destroy its whole ideology of Zionism. Zionism that makes other people goyim, who do not deserve to be in the Holy Land. That's the real problem. If Israel will embrace every people, including Palestinians, equally, human rights respected across the board, then I would challenge Hamas to change its charter and say we will acknowledge Israel. But until that time, I see no difference between Nelson Mandela and Hamas in refusing to accept apartheid or the Zionist Israeli state.
You mentioned sexual violence. I was part of the human rights vetting process for arms going to Israel, and a charity called Defense of Children International Palestine drew our attention at the State Department to the sexual assault, actually the rape, of a 13-year-old boy that occurred in an Israeli prison in the Mosque Bia in Jerusalem. We examined these allegations. We believed they were credible. We put them to the government of Israel. And you know what happened the next day? The IDF went into the DCIP offices and removed all their computers and declared them a terrorist entity. I can't recall a time in my experience where I've seen such a disconnect between our values and our actions, or between the perspectives of our political leadership and the realities on the ground. You know, here we are 2 months into this conflict, and we have seen 3 times more children die, 6,000 in Gaza, than in 2 years of Russia's war against Ukraine. Is Israel more secure as a result of our assistance, or has our military assistance enabled Israel to move ahead with the expansion of settlements in the West Bank, to continue the siege of Gaza? We seem like hypocrites when we criticize Russia for human rights abuses, but fail to do so with Israel. As we are the provider of arms, as we are the provider of billions of dollars in taxpayer-funded assistance every year to what is actually a wealthy country, how do you neutralize Hamas? The answer is through a lasting political settlement that provides a Palestinian state, not a process that promises one, holds out the promise, and never gets to it. You neutralize Hamas by showing the Palestinian people that if they want to succeed, the route is there for them to do so through a political process rather than through violent resistance. Until we have that political process in place, you cannot defeat the Palestinian resistance.
Here's every hospital Israel's bombed in the last 10 years. And schools. Refugee camps.
This is uncut.
Now Israel is saying that this hospital bombing wasn't them, and sure, they ordered all the hospitals in Gaza to evacuate 3 days before the bombing, and sure, the Al-Ahli staff said they got phone calls for 3 straight days before the bombing telling them to evacuate. And of course, there's also the multiple tweets Israel deleted shortly after the bombing, and the laughably fake phone call Israel claimed to have intercepted between 2 Palestinian militants. the Al Jazeera investigation, which completely debunks Israel's claim that a Palestinian rocket fell on the hospital, the multiple military veterans that have said the projectile sounds exactly like a US manufactured missile, and of course there's also the fact that Israeli generals and politicians have been promising to flatten Gaza for the last 2 weeks, saying there are no innocent civilians in Gaza, and yeah, they turned off all the electricity to Gaza, all but collapsing the hospital system a week before the bombing, and I know what you're probably thinking right now. Israel did it. But here's the thing. This is what experts call anti-Israel bias.
Israeli occupation. I don't recall one occupation in which the occupier presents himself as the victim. Not only the victim, the only victim. If to quote here the late Golda Meir, whom I quoted also last time, I know, but it is so unforgettable I have to use it again. She once said that we will never forgive the Arabs for forcing us to kill their children. We are the victims. We are forced to kill their children. Poor us. And as the victim and the only victim in history, again, it enables us the rights to do whatever we want, and nobody is going to tell us what to do, because we are the only victims.
I'm an American Jew. Let me tell you why I unconditionally support Palestine. Growing up, I remember hearing about how Jewish people were excluded from public life. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws were put into effect. It stripped German Jews of their citizenship and their right to marry Germans. In 2018, the Israeli nation-state law was passed. It downgraded Arabic and established settling in the national interest. There was a ban on intermarriage, and groups like Lahava, which are responsible for pogroms on the ground, terrorize anybody who tries to marry, and often just anybody who's Palestinian. My grandparents told me stories about how in 1939, all Jews were forced to wear a Star of David. It made them an easier target, easier to identify. Palestinians are forced to have specific ID cards which indicate their level of access. Palestinian vehicles have to have different colored license plates which indicate which roads they are or not allowed to drive on. Following the invasion of Poland, Jews were forced into ghettos, barbed wire, fences, cut off from the rest of society. They faced shortages of food, water, and medicine, and they lived in constant fear. Gaza has been under blockade from food, water, and medicine. In 1939, the Germans bombed the Warsaw Ghetto. For the last 2 decades, the Israeli occupation has been relentlessly bombing the Gaza Strip, in a tactic that they refer to as mowing the lawn. All Jewish history is about rooting for the underdog. If you supported the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, then you understand oppressed people wanting to free themselves. Do you think the Maccabees are more aligned with the Palestinians or the Israeli occupation? I don't know about you guys, but I'm old enough to remember when Jews rooted for David and not Goliath.
$5,000 is what I was just offered to pledge my support to Israel. This Zionist organization emailed me this morning and they said, "We have been following your content on TikTok and appreciate your passion for the Middle East. Our organization, which seeks to help understanding, would like to offer you a sponsorship opportunity. We have noticed your support for the Palestinian cause and we respect your dedication to important issues. However, we believe that there may be some misunderstandings and misperceptions regarding Israel and you have fallen for the lies of the rabid dogs. We are willing to offer you $5,000 to go live and pledge your support for Israel. We aim to provide you with resources and experts who can make you see the truth."
Israel is one of the most racist countries in the world. While you'll never hear anyone in the mainstream media say this, this is actually one of the most important things you need to understand if you want to know what's happening right now. From its inception, the whole idea of Israel as a country was based on racism. Israel was conceived as a Jewish state, and while there's nothing wrong in principle with Jews having a homeland, the problem is that they insisted that that homeland had to be in Palestine, which already belonged to someone, the Palestinians. The slogan of Israel's founders was "a land for a people without a land." But deep down, they all knew that the only way to have a Jewish majority in Palestine, an Arab country, was to expel the Arabs. One of the founders of Israel, Yosef Weitz, wrote, "There's no room in the country for both peoples. There's no way but to transfer the Arabs from here to neighboring countries." Israel was quite literally founded by expelling and massacring hundreds of thousands of Arabs in a years-long process called the Nakba. And when you found a country based on racial exclusion, you're gonna get a culture that fosters and celebrates racial exclusion. Because countries that commit terrible atrocities rarely acknowledge committing those atrocities. And the presence of Palestinians who remained in Palestine became a constant reminder, not only of the violence that founded Israel, but of the constantly looming threat that they might come back and try to reclaim their land. Every day you can find videos coming out of Israel showing Israelis calling for all Arabs to die, insulting the Prophet Muhammad, desecrating mosques, spitting on Christians, mocking and celebrating the murder of Palestinians, committing violent hate crimes against Palestinians, watching Gaza get carpet bombed from a cliffside for entertainment. But don't just go off these anecdotes. Let's look at some of the polls. One poll found that 2/3 of Israeli teens believe Arabs to be less intelligent, uncultured, and violent. It also found that 50% of Israelis wouldn't live in the same building as Arabs, wouldn't befriend Arabs, wouldn't let their children befriend Arabs, and wouldn't let Arabs into their homes. Another poll found that 60% of Israeli Jews want segregation from Arabs. Another poll found that half of Israeli Jews agree with the statement, "Most Jews are better than most non-Jews because they were born Jews." The poll also found that 88% of Israeli Jews would be disturbed if their son befriended an Arab girl, and 90% would be disturbed if their daughter befriended an Arab boy. This poll found that about half of Israeli high schoolers don't think Arabs should have the right to vote. Another poll showed that almost half of Israeli Jews don't want Arabs teaching their kids. Not only are these views widely held in Israeli society, they're also represented in government, which codifies these sentiments into law. For example, Israel has a law that says if an Israeli marries a Palestinian, or someone from several other regional Arab states, that person isn't allowed to move in with said Israeli. This law was passed in 2003, but it's been renewed every single year since. Israel also doesn't allow interreligious marriage to be performed in the country, which is meant to deter Jews from marrying non-Jews. In 2018, Israel passed the nation-state law, a law which has constitutional status, which says the right to exercise national self-determination, i.e. have rights, is the exclusive right of Jews, no one else. There's also the Nakba law, which makes it illegal to acknowledge the Nakba, the expulsions of Palestinians that were needed to found Israel. This would be like passing a law to make it illegal to talk about indigenous genocide or slavery in America. There's also the Admissions Committee Law, which basically allows towns to operate panels that deny applications for entry based on socio-cultural compatibility, which essentially just legalizes racist housing discrimination. In Israel, advocating genocide of Palestinians doesn't hurt your chances of holding a high position in government. And in fact, in many cases, it helps. In 2014, Israeli lawmaker Ayelet Shaked wrote an unhinged rant on Facebook, calling all Palestinians enemy combatants and saying their mothers should be killed for giving birth to, quote, little snakes. The next year, she was appointed Minister of Justice by Benjamin Netanyahu. Itamar Ben-Gvir, a lifelong admirer of Meir Kahane, an Arab exterminationist, a man who praised a Jewish settler who killed a Palestinian for throwing a rock at him, a man who was famously acquitted after being criminally charged for chanting death to Arabs, is Israel's current Minister of National Security. He's not some fringe figure either. He's one of the most popular politicians in Israel right now. In the last few days, Israel's been working hard to cast itself as the victim of hatred, the victim of terrorism, the victim of anti-Semitism, that they have no choice but to lay siege to Gaza. But underneath this carefully concocted victim complex is a racist, Jewish supremacist state that's been trying to finish the job that the Nakba started for decades. And really, this shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. After all, they're literally cutting off water and electricity to a city of 2 million people right now. Their generals talk openly about flattening Gaza and killing the animals, meaning Palestinians. It's obvious their goal is genocide. Anti-Semitism, that they have no choice but to lay siege to Gaza.
There is a huge expense, almost endless space in the Sinai desert, just on the other side of Gaza. The idea is, and this is not the first time it will be done, the idea is for them to leave over to the open areas where we and the international community will prepare the infrastructure, tent cities with food and with water. You know what? Just like for the refugees of Syria that fled the butchering of Assad a few years ago to Turkey. Turkey received 2 million of them. This is the idea. Again, I say there is a way to receive them all on the other side for temporary time on Sinai. Because what did Hamas turn out?
On the other side, are we talking about Rafah? Are you saying the other side that go to Egypt?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And Egypt will have to play ball because this is human life is at stake. Well, we want to open a humanitarian corridor so they can leave. But if Hamas...
So that who can leave? So that who can leave? Citizens? You're saying civilians can leave, but only through the Rafah border, correct?
At this point, yes.
So they can't come...
Where else?
Your country! They can come into Israel!
I'm telling you one more thing I want to say.
I want you to address that point. Don't just smile, sir, respectfully. You're saying you're making a corridor. They can go to Egypt. You're bombing them. You say you want to save them, but they can't come in.
First of all, I'm not smiling. I'm crying in my heart. I'm crying in my heart.
It's time the media stop framing this as a hunt for Hamas, whatever that means, because we have so much evidence this is in fact a war of mass forcible population transfers. It's just memory hole. This has not been mentioned, as far as I've seen, in any mainstream media. John Hudson is a reporter for the Washington Post, but it was a tweet. It has not been meaningfully reported out. It has not been discussed. It's not been centered as a war aim. Our media largely is still operating under this liberal delusion that this is a kind of zero dark 30 hunt for Hamas, where a bunch of guys are going through with tactical gear and they're finding that is merged with a kind of Rambo 2 scenario where they're rescuing hostages, even though, again, nothing Israel has done has indicated that this is their strategy, that their strategy is in fact to raise Gaza and to make it uninhabitable, as they explicitly said they were going to do in the eyes, again, as you've documented many times. But, a lot of delusions about the potential, the sort of squaring the circle of liberal support for Israel has never kind of made sense. This is just a more extreme version of it, which is you fundamentally have to deny the reality of what's going on. Gaza's not occupied. It's just encircled and militarily cut off, and they control the what goes in and what goes out, and the fuel and the water and electricity. But no, it's not occupied. This is just one more delusion on top of that. And, I don't know what else one can do but point out. Because, again, I think if someone says, if the New York Times says, because, again, there's all this kind of media bullying that goes on with these pro-Israel groups where They like to act like the New York Times is some hotbed of pro-Hamas sympathy. So anytime they point something out that's inconvenient, or do so in a way that's viewed as being tabloidy, and I note this in my piece, that there's this kind of fear of the tabloidy in the G word. Genocide, you can't use it because it's seen as being libelous or sort of co-opting the Holocaust. And I understand that, and let's not use that word, right? Let's sort of set that aside, even though I think it is, again, at least when you talk about intent, I think it's clear. Let's use the word forcible population transfers, at least something that sort of indicates that their goal is to get Palestinians out of Palestine. That is their clear as day goal, and it's also inherent in the project of how Israel was founded, right? This is the Nakba never ended in key ways. It's not just a sort of thing people say. It's true. It is the subjugation and the expulsion of people who are from that land. 75% of people in Gaza are refugees of what we would call, quote unquote, Israel proper. These are people that are displaced from their homes. And the descendants of those displaced from their homes. And so it's just, they don't want to, because once you broach that subject, then it leads to more existential questions about what it means to support this. So that's why this kind of fictitious war on terror framework is so important to maintain, no matter how incredible it is. And even I would think, if you said, okay, 6 weeks ago, Netanyahu comes out and explicitly says we are trying to resettle Palestinians out of Gaza, I'd say, okay, well, the media sort of has to cover that. The American media has to center that. That seems like big news. It's just not mentioned. And I honestly don't know what else to say. I mean, I think the cognitive dissonance that would be brought to the surface from something like that would be almost too great for people to handle. It's too politically inconvenient. Because again, I think so much of the specter of Trump colors this, and people aren't stupid. They can look at the way in which Gaza has completely torpedoed Biden's reelection.
But when you say decapitated 40 babies, you are planting a certain image,
well, who has
with
said
a certain
that?
trigger in people's mind.
Who has said that? Who has said? 40
Who has said that? Who has said
that?
40 decapitated?
Who has said
you
that?
You have repeat.
No, I haven't.
What?
I've never said that.
You haven't said on your show 40 decapitated babies?
I choked up earlier reading this new revelation about 40 babies being killed.
Oh my God.
And some of them being beheaded. And I was like, how can any human being do that to a baby? Never.
The claim comes from this journalist during a walk and talk. She makes the claim saying,
I see in the distance more bodies being covered. Babies. Their heads cut off.
Later in a tweet, however, she admits that she did not see bodies, but heard a soldier talking about it.
Have you seen this video?
Inside, we found 8 babies burned in this corner.
An Israeli soldier conducts an interview in front of a destroyed home of a kibbutz. He says Hamas fighters burned babies and then beheaded them, but this is all a lie, and I'm going to prove it to you using Israeli media. Yes, that is right, Israeli media. But first, let's ask an important question. How did the concrete walls of this home behind the soldier turn into rubble? Fires burn wood and other flammable items. They do not collapse concrete structures like this.
Children in the same room, then someone come and kills them all. 15 girls and teenagers that put in the same room, 3 hand grenades, and it's over. This is a massacre.
Now, the Israelis want you to believe that Hamas fighters did this, but we know that they were only armed with machine guns and small grenade launchers. That doesn't cause this level of damage. So then how did they destroy concrete homes like this? The answer is they didn't. The Israelis did. What? That is shocking. But why? And how would the Israelis do that? Well, Israeli media has all the answers. They interviewed the IDF soldiers who responded to the Hamas attack, and they learned something shocking. The IDF was struggling to handle the Hamas fighters. Tuval Eskapa, or however you pronounce his name, a member of the security team for Kibbutz Be'eri, set up a hotline to coordinate between kibbutz residents and the Israeli army. He told the Israeli newspaper Haaretz that as desperation began to set in, the commanders in the field made difficult decisions, including shelling houses on their occupants in order to eliminate the terrorists along with the hostages. These reports indicate that orders came down from the military's high command to attack homes and other areas inside Israel, even at the cost of many Israeli lives. According to Haaretz, the army was only able to restore control over Be'eri after admittedly shelling the homes of Israelis who had been taken captive. The price was terrible. At least 112 residents were killed, according to the paper. Others were kidnapped. Now, much of the shelling in Be'eri was carried out by Israeli tank crews. As a reporter for the Israeli Foreign Ministry-sponsored outlet I-24 noted during a visit to Be'eri.
Small and quaint homes bombarded or destroyed.
Children's toys lying around, well-maintained lawns of grass ripped up by the tracks of an armored vehicle. Perhaps a tank. Perhaps a tank. Perhaps a tank.
In other words, the IDF, in an act of desperation, decided to just kill everyone, including hostages. This is their words, not mine. In fact, Yasmin Porat, an attendee of the Nova Music Festival, who fled into the kibbutz, told Israeli radio that when Israeli special forces arrived during a hostage standoff, they, quote, eliminated everyone, including the hostages, because there was very, very heavy crossfire.
כי היה שם חילופי ירי מאוד מאוד קשים, חילופי אש מטורפים, אפילו שני פקדים של טנק שירו לתוך הבית, שזה בית קיבוצי קטן, זה לא איזה רואים את זה בחדשות.
She goes on to describe how Hamas militants tied her partner's hands behind his back. She saw her partner lying on the ground, still alive. She went on to say that Israeli security forces killed him and other hostages as they opened fire on the remaining militants inside, including with tank shells.
ובן הזוג שלך שהיה איתך? נהרג. הוא גם נהרג.
This is why you see large bits of shrapnel and bullet holes in the walls of destroyed kibbutz homes. It's why you see homes turn into rubble. And sadly, it's why you find severely burnt bodies of Israeli hostages. But there's more. The IDF also used Apache attack helicopters.
פתאום אתה רואה טיל ממסוק שיורה לתוך הקיבוץ. זאת אומרת, לא הבנתי. מסוק צה"לי יורה לתוך קיבוץ ישראלי, ואז אתה רואה טנק נוסע ברחובות הקיבוץ, מצודד את התותח ויורה פגז לתוך בית. זה דברים שאתה לא מצליח להבין.
In an interview with Israeli media outlet Mako, an Apache pilot admitted that many of the cars he fired rockets at contained hostages. But wait, there's even more. Israeli security forces also opened fire on fleeing Israelis whom they mistook for Hamas gunmen. A resident of Ashkelon named Danielle Rachel described nearly being killed after escaping from the Nova Music Festival when it was attacked by militants. As we reached the roundabout at a kibbutz, we saw Israeli security forces, she recalled. We held our heads down because we automatically knew they'd be suspicious of us in a small beat-up car from the same direction the terrorists were coming. Our forces began shooting at us. Lastly, let's discuss how an IDF commander ordered an airstrike on his own position. The very first target the Palestinian fighters attacked was the Erez checkpoint. The attack was so fierce that the IDF commander, Avi Rosenfeld, in an act of desperation, he called for an airstrike on his own position. The IDF bombed their own base in order to kill the Palestinian militants. So what should we take from all this? Do we absolve Hamas of their actions on October 7th? Of course not. None of this would have happened had they not attacked. Now, whether or not they have the right to resist occupation and apartheid with the use of force is a topic for another video. But the point of this video is to highlight how the IDF's poor response and performance led to the deaths of their own people. As several Israeli hostages have already made clear, the Palestinian militants were kind to them despite the aggression. And as the Nova survivor Yasmin Porat put it, she believes the militants didn't want to kill them. She believes their goal was to take them back to Gaza as hostages. The entire point of the attack seems to be the capturing of Israelis as hostages in order to trade them for thousands of Palestinian political prisoners. And in the chaos that ensued, many people lost their lives. Now, some people say, who cares how it went down? People died. Babies died. Is that not awful? Well, of course it is. But the reason we have to cut through Israeli propaganda is because it's being used to justify acts of genocide in Gaza. Israelis believe deep down to their core that their babies were beheaded and that their women were raped and tortured before being killed. And this simply isn't true. And even with Israeli media reporting the facts, they may never change their minds. But the rest of the world needs to know the truth, because it is the world that has given Israel the green light to commit acts of atrocity in Gaza. And there's growing concern of an escalation that may erupt into a greater regional conflict. So share this video and help spread the facts. The world deserves to know the truth.
It's become a pattern. Each time Israel steps up its bombing campaign against Gaza, it spreads a new talking point about Hamas brutality to justify or distract from its actions. Early in the war, these claims concerned the killing of civilians by Hamas, which certainly did happen, but they also included claims about the sadistic and ritualistic murder of babies, which didn't happen. The latter claims were used to say Hamas is the same as ISIS, but those weren't true. One baby in total was killed on October the 7th, which is bad enough, of course, but contrary to a claim repeated by the literal President of the United States, the baby was not beheaded.
As you well know, many women and girls were attacked brutally by Hamas on October 7th, and they have testified to the gender-based violence that they both experienced and witnessed. As a global community, we must respond to weaponized sexual violence wherever it happens with absolute condemnation.
Clinton went on to say, quote, "It is outrageous that some who claim to stand for justice are closing their eyes and their hearts to the victims of Hamas." So sort of taking a similar attack line at people who aren't saying the same thing as her, essentially. Benjamin Netanyahu has taken a similar line.
Organizations to the human rights organizations. You've heard of the rape of Israeli women? Horrible atrocities, sexual mutilation? Where the hell are you? I expect all civilized leaders, governments, nations to speak up against this atrocity.
The Haaretz article I showed you earlier was shared by a number of famous journalists like Jake Tapper from CNN. And Tapper repeated the headline claim that Hamas campaign of rape against Israeli women has been revealed testimony after testimony. Now, I read that article, it's quite long, and it's quite strange for this reason. It doesn't actually contain any testimony.
A notorious case in point, an investigation the Times published back in December, which alleged that Hamas deliberately weaponized rape and sexual violence on October 7th. Those claims have since been unsubstantiated, if not disproven, revealing the Times' pro-Israeli, anti-Palestinian bias and leaving the paper's newsroom riven by dissent. But for the Times' critics, including some of its former reporters, the article is a mere symptom of an age-old problem, a persistent double standard in the stories the paper deems fit to print on Israel and Palestine, and those it does not.
The role of the New York Times is not defined by its circulation. It's defined by the fact that it sets the agenda. That's number one. Number two, most newspapers do not have foreign bureaus, and so they will run the Times foreign coverage. So that's the power of the Times. It sets the agenda.
Starting with something that is definitely not breaking news, the American newspaper of record, the New York Times, has a track record of supporting Israel. What is new are the stakes. Israel is on trial for genocide at the International Court of Justice. Core to its propaganda effort has been framing Hamas's attacks on October 7th as extraordinarily sadistic, like something out of the ISIS playbook.
The wholesale massacre, mutilation, rape, and abduction of as many citizens as the terrorists could find.
Enter the Times and this story, published in late December. It accused Palestinian militants of weaponizing rape and sexual violence, systematically unleashing it on Israeli women and men. A lurid allegation, a sensational story, but one that the evidence simply fails to support.
When the New York Times said, we've done a 2-month-long investigation, we interviewed 150 people, and we found a broad pattern of sexual violence on October 7th. That, for a lot of people, just closed the case. If the New York Times is saying it, then it must be true. I even had friends who know how much Israel misrepresents things and lies, who said, Ali, now, surely you have to give some credence to what it's saying. But it's a case of journalistic fraud, because it just doesn't deliver the goods.
The principal criticism lies within the main claim, which is that not only did sexual assault and occasions of rape occur, but that they were used systematically. Since that report has been published, major flaws have emerged, not just in the contents itself, but also when it comes to the actual journalists and authors behind the report.
Alternative U.S. news outlets, subscriber-funded ones like Mondovice, Electronic Intifada, and The Gray Zone went to work debunking the Times' story. They noted the article contained zero direct testimony from victims, that the alleged eyewitnesses the paper quoted were either anonymous or of dubious credibility, that the family of a woman killed on October 7th disputed the Times' assertion that she had been raped. Another of the Times' sources accused the reporters of pressuring them to speak, saying it was important for Israel's PR effort. One of the reporters involved, Anat Schwartz, had never filed a news story before October 7th. She is a filmmaker whose Wikipedia page said she had worked for Israeli intelligence. Had the Times done its homework, its editors would have known that Schwartz's social media accounts revealed she had liked some disturbing posts, including one advocating turning Gaza into a slaughterhouse, a post South Africa included in its case against Israel at the ICJ. Not that the story was Schwartz's idea, as she explained to Israeli Army radio.
הניו יורק טיימס אמר בוא נעשה תחקיר על אלימות מינית. זה היה יותר לשכנע אותי מאשר הם אמרו מההתחלה.
זו הצעה של הניו יורק טיימס כל המחקר, כל התחקיר הזה?
חד משמעית.
It was an odd way for such a report to come together. Still, the Times published it and showcased it.
Imagine it was the other way around. Any Palestinian who whispers something that is considered politically incorrect is out in a second. And yet you have this person who worked for the Israeli intelligence, who wasn't a journalist, and who liked on social media these blood-curdling calls for the decimation of Palestinians in Gaza. And that's the person you hire to report on your story. The disparity between the standards is staggering.
When Russia invaded Ukraine, Ukrainians had a right to resist. Yet when Palestinians resist their occupier, it's the occupier, not the occupied, that supposedly has the right to defend itself. Now, this is the completely morally inconsistent position coming out from the West right now. And it gets even worse. Look at these two clips from a White House spokesperson. The first is from this week.
Being honest about the fact that there have been civilian casualties and that there likely will be more is being honest, because that's what war is. It's brutal, it's ugly, it's messy. I've said that before. The president also said that yesterday. Doesn't mean we have to like it.
That was National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby, basically telling journalists to grow up. War is dirty, war is messy, good people die, but that's life. What do you want me to do about it, right? This is war, people die. Now compare that to how Kirby talked about civilian deaths in Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Hard to look at what he's doing in Ukraine, what his forces are doing in Ukraine, and think that any ethical, moral individual could justify that. It's difficult to look at the It's difficult to look at some of the images and imagine that any well-thinking, serious, mature leader would do that.
So the killing of Ukrainian civilians brings John Kirby to tears. Fine, right? Got no problem with that. But when Palestinians are killed by a US ally, meh, these things happen. People die, it's war.
The Western media killed my family, 21 members of my family. The Israelis pulled the trigger. The Americans made the bomb, and the media enabled them. They gave them the cover to do as many atrocities as they desire. My nieces and nephews were cut into pieces. Their body parts were everywhere, mixed with the stones and the rocks of my family's house. And we're seeing the politicians, the journalists, turning a blind eye. Some people actually commented, Hamas killed your family, blame Hamas. But we know who killed our families. We know who these F-16 belong to. We know our killers. We know our murderers. And we will never forgive them. Bombing hospitals, bombing schools, bombing the mosques, bombing churches, bombing refugee camps. And yes, you covered what happened on the 7th of October. Good for you. Now cover what Israel is doing to Gaza. They don't. They don't think of us as equally human beings. Palestinians die, Israelis killed. Palestinians are terrorists, Israeli army, no. Although if you compare and contrast between the casualties of the Palestinians and the Israelis, when it comes to the civilians, the number of Palestinians would be 100 times higher. When the media cares about 40 beheaded babies, fake news, and then people get this first impression They keep this first impression, and then the first impression in media always lasts forever. And then after a day or two, they change that, but people already got the impression, and it's very difficult to erase this impression.
Remember early on in this horror show when Al-Shifa Hospital was bombed and there was a non-stop controversy about who bombed it? Was it Israel or was it a misfired Islamic Jihad rocket? The basis of the controversy was that it was understood that attacking hospitals represents a grave war crime. That's why Israel was so keen to deny responsibility. So what happened after that? Israel attacked every single hospital and health facility in Gaza, all 36 of them, rendering most of them inoperable, slaughtering doctors, nurses, patients, and it all just became normalised. There was no need for any controversy about whether a misfired rocket was involved in all of these horrors. Which brings me on to the so-called Flower Massacre. What a phrase to have to utter. Flower Massacre. A massacre of desperate Palestinians queuing for flour as they and their families starve, as famine stalks the land. An artificial famine, a famine imposed by the Israeli state, by their siege, combined with the apocalyptic levels of destruction unleashed against Gaza by the Israeli state, causing the fastest decline in a population's nutrition status ever recorded, meaning, as Medical Aid for Palestinians puts it, that children are being starved at the fastest rate the world has ever seen. That's the context for what happened last week on the 29th of February, when more than 110 Palestinians were killed and hundreds wounded. After over a month of Israel preventing any aid reaching northern Gaza, a convoy arrived where starving Palestinians had gathered nearby the sea. Now let's be clear, the Israeli state massacred these Palestinians. Let's just be so abundantly clear about this from the outset. Now I accurately summed up Al Jazeera's article on this massacre. I tweeted out, the Israeli army just massacred over 100 Palestinians as they tried to get flour for their families. Israeli tanks then ran over the dead and injured bodies. The Israeli state is committing these atrocities knowing it can get away with anything. That is indeed how Al Jazeera correctly reported this massacre. Then Elon Levy, the shameless official spokesperson for the Israeli government, a propagandist whose job it is to defend a murderous onslaught against Gaza defined by multiple war crimes, quote tweeted that with blood libel, those poor people were killed when they were crushed in a stampede and in some cases run over by the Gazan truck drivers as they tried to get out. But go ahead, blame Israel. Blood libel.
Cass Sunstein had this term he uses called crippling epistemology, which is like basically your entire worldview is so fucked that it doesn't. When you're using a hunt for Hamas narrative framework, then you'd say, well, why would they attack a hospital? If they're not looking for Hamas there, right? If there's not a command and control center there, why would they attack a hospital? Are they sort of gratuitously evil? And it's like, well, perhaps, but more to the point, they issued an evacuation order on October 13th that said everybody in North Gaza has to leave, including medical facilities. They called Al-Shifa Hospital several times and said, you have to leave, per the October 13th evacuation order. The forcible population transfer framework is the most elegant way to understand everything Israel has done, because they said this is what they're going to do, and they issued a clear as day in Hebrew and Arabic an evacuation order, which you can go online and read. It says everybody in North Gaza, no exceptions, including in Gaza City, has to go to the south, because we are going to raise northern Gaza and turn it into a demilitarized zone, whatever. They said that sort of separately, but that was what their order said, okay? Every attack on every hospital, every attack on every school, every attack on every civilian, every bombing terror campaign is designed specifically around moving roughly 1.1 million people to South Gaza. That is the way you understand it as forcible population transfers, because they issued an order saying this is what they were going to do. But that looks bad. So then they say pretty much anywhere they need to clear out, because by definition, hospitals are going to be one of the last places to clear out. Right? Because they can't leave. They physically can't leave. NICU babies and infirmed people and those with, serious conditions can't just get up and walk 20, 30 miles to South Gaza. They'll die, especially when there's not clean water. And the convoys and the roads themselves are being bombed. And medical professionals have a duty to stay with patients. They can't leave them. So by definition, places like hospitals will be the last places to leave. So then Israel knows this. So what do they start doing? They start building pretextual cases to say, oh, actually, we have to bomb this hospital. We have to snipe at them. We have to shoot them. We have to terrorize them with shelling because they're Hamas command center. Now, they had peppered this idea that Shifa was a Hamas command center before because they bombed it before. In 2014, they bombed Al-Shifa. So this is something they've peppered before, but there was never really any evidence. They had one throwaway line in some Amnesty report about maybe one of the rooms being used by Hamas for interrogation. 2008, some New York Times reporter said he saw a Hamas fighter there. I guess if I saw an IDF fighter around a hospital in 2008, that would make it a legitimate military target. It's unclear. It was extremely razor thin. We know it's razor thin because if Israel had evidence it was a command and control center, they would have provided it, not just built a 3D graphic showing a Bond villain layer that looked goofy to even the most credulous eye. And so they subsequently, then they did this with every hospital they attacked. They said, oh, they were shooting at us. Hamas was shooting at us. And then every single article in the New York Times and Washington Post uses this framework. It says, the hunt for Hamas leads to attack on this hospital. This hospital, as the New York Times said, quote, caught in a crossfire. There's no crossfire. Now, were Israeli convoys attacked by fighters as they approached these hospitals? Yes, but there's no actual fighting coming from inside the hospital because it's a fucking hospital. And Hamas, which has, let's say 15% support, whatever, Gaza, let's say 40%, whatever the number is, right? It's gone up since October 7th. You cannot have a quasi-popular movement if you're using fucking hospitals. It's just common sense. Hospitals is military bases. You're going to have 0% support if you do that. Now, do they store guns in mosques here or there or residential areas? Well, yeah, because they're a guerrilla force. That's what you do. But there's very little evidence Hamas uses in any kind of systemic way hospitals as some sort of military base. There's no evidence of that at all. There never has been any evidence of that because it doesn't make sense. They don't need to. And this whole human shields framework, which is again predicated on kind of racist sleights of hand that doesn't actually have any empirical basis, becomes a kind of catch-all where you can use that for any hospital or any UN school you want to attack. Say, oh, well, there's guns there. I don't know, is there? And this is what they did. They would sort of half-assedly, and again, the most half-assed way possible. They're not even really trying. In the other hospital they attacked, they'd say, oh, well, yeah, it was a Hamas control center. And it's like, well, okay. And then they would just say, people shot at us, and they would move on. And there was no evidence of finding, and maybe they would find some little thing in the ground and say, that's a tunnel. That sort of shows this was, and then they'd move on. But most of the time, they didn't even bother with that. Most of the time, they would just attack a hospital, shell it, and then move on. And the media would go, okay. And this kind of hunt for Hamas pretexts for every single thing that they were needing to clear out per their evacuation order of October 13th, was the preferred framework of our reporters because, again, it confirmed ideological racist priors. It put it into this, it assumed good faith on the part of Israel that they sort of wanted to reduce civilian casualties, which we now know is not true, right? Reporting in 972 magazine and then even the CNN's own analysis of the amount of dumb bomb, quote unquote dumb bombs they use, right? 50% of the bombs they use aren't even quote unquote precision, whatever that means. Even though precision aren't even precision, but they're not even trying, right? They're deliberately targeting civilians, deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure. We know this. That you had to hold on to this idea that they were sort of hunting Hamas leaders and Hamas control centers. And it didn't matter if it never made any sense. It didn't matter if everyone knew it was bullshit at the time. Because if Israel had evidence that Shifa was this Dr. No layer, we would have had evidence. Instead, they did this little selective, limited hangout thing where they showed some New York Times or some dopey New York Times reporters, supposedly some exits where Hamas fighters were. We now know that was not true at all. Because that's what you do when you're trying to clear out an evacuation order for 1 million people who have intergenerational trauma over the Nakba and don't want to just leave over, because you promised they'll come back. Because the last time they left, they never came back.
A former Jerusalem bureau chief turned columnist, Friedman infamously backed the 2003 US-led invasion of Iraq that was based on lies and did so in the most offensive, cavalier way.
What they needed to see was American boys and girls going house to house from Basra to Baghdad and basically saying, well, suck on this, okay?
This time around, Friedman concocted a column comparing the Middle East to an animal kingdom, with America cast as an old lion, Iranians as wasps, and Hamas as some kind of spider.
When he likens the Palestinians and various other players in the region to animals, It's horrifyingly offensive at a time when the Israelis are saying that the Palestinians in Gaza are human animals. And even more offensive than that is treating a situation like this as some kind of fable or barnyard story, rather than actually understanding the reality of the Palestinians, that this is an oppressed people, this is an occupied people.
It's classic colonialism, classic racism, and wherever you look in a settler colonial project, the British in Kenya or India, they spoke in the same language and they used overwhelming force to subdue a population that they considered less than human and only capable of understanding violence.
And that is, and if I'm doing the mass expulsion of Palestinians out of Gaza, the first thing I do is, and if you get one of my primary, again, it's dynamic. It's not, they're trying to do this thing in stages. The first thing you do is you evacuate the north to the south. I mean, that is what you would do. And so they did this, but that was never the framework Western media used, because they used the framework that Israel gave them. And they just accepted it, even though again and again and again and again, and it flies in the face of what we actually see with our fucking eyes. Like, you can see what they're doing, but don't trust your lying eyes. It's a hunt for Hamas.
It happened with Shireen Abu Akleh, for example. They killed Shireen Abu Akleh, the journalist, and then they said,
Miss Abu Akleh was killed by Palestinian terrorists' fire.
And we all know it was a lie. But the Western media, right away, they took the news from the Israeli army.
Israel's prime minister called the death unfortunate and blamed it on Palestinians, claiming they were, quote, firing indiscriminately.
An official even took credit for their, quote, PR blitz, saying they had successfully influenced the Associated Press and BBC's coverage to cast doubt over who had killed Shireen.
A few months later, the Israelis said, no, it was ours. But it was too late.
On Monday, the Israeli military admitted for the first time that Shireen was likely killed by one of its soldiers. The army will not be pursuing a criminal investigation, however.
They did the same thing with the bombing of the hospital. They said, no, it's a Palestinian missile. Oh, come on, do you think we're stupid? It landed on the right place, on the right time, of the hospital that you already warned to evacuate. But the media would pick up that, and that would be the first impression. The Palestinians killed themselves, and then now they came up with another lie. A baby baked in an oven. Come on. And then a few days later they said, no, actually, this is not actually true. And the media always repeats these lies. And with these lies, they are creating the cover for Israel to commit its massacre. They're creating an atmosphere that Israel is dealing with a very, very dangerous, inhumane enemy. And this enemy is not Hamas, this enemy is all the Palestinian people, because the Palestinian people are Hamas, and Hamas is ISIS, so the Palestinian people are ISIS, and we're dangerous, we should get rid of them, we should kill them all, we should displace them, send them to Sinai, and you draw all of this picture. At the same time, Israel is doing all of that on us. They are literally killing us live on the news every day, and thousands of people are being killed, thousands of children are being murdered and massacred. And we're screaming to the media, please cover that, talk about it, and they just don't.
I am sorry to say that your mass media, the Western mass media, always beside the Israelis. Your baby in this area.
Suffer several areas. We have been asking the Gazan to move to the Mawasi area, which is the area closest to the sea. And this is where the big tent cities have been established. Fighting in the southern Han Yunis does not mean that we're fighting in the same area. And as you've seen in the last couple of weeks, the fighting is very surgical, it is slow, it is very methodical. We are trying not to reach any of the non-combatant population in the Gaza Strip. And I think that there is no way that we can eradicate the Hamas without dealing with most of its forces that have fled to the south. Now, again, one little note, the non-combatant population in the Gaza Strip is really a non-existent term, because all of the Gazans have voted for the Hamas, and as we have seen on the 7th of October, most of the population in the Gaza Strip are Hamas. Nonetheless, we are treating them as non-combatant. We are treating them as regular civilians, and they are spared from the fighting.
What happened, CNN quietly cut, according to the HuffPost headline, disputed Israeli military claim from some video reports. HuffPost writes, in several other broadcasts of Robertson's report, which had included, we talked about this earlier in the show, a calendar that was supposed to be like a Hamas, like
it was
a
supposed
shift
to be,
schedule.
yes, where Hamas militants or terrorists were recording their names for their shifts of watching the hostages.
Right.
And in reality, it was a calendar.
Why do you think so many Israelis were so outraged and upset by your film?
Because I think it shows their truth, a truth that they're trying to hide for so long. What they call the Day of Independence is our catastrophe, Nakba, and they don't want to people to know this state was built on destroying villages and killing people.
To make way for Israel's creation in 1948, Zionist militias expelled at least 750,000 Palestinians from their lands. These militias also killed about 15,000 Palestinians in a series of mass atrocities and massacres. Palestinians refer to these events as the Nakba, meaning the catastrophe, and for them, the Nakba never ended.
What we see today in the news only confirms that the Nakba is still continuous. The wound is still bleeding. This is why when people tell me why are you opening an old wound, I say that the wound is still bleeding and the Nakba is still continuous. It's still happening every day.
Nakba, Nakba, no! We want Nakba, Nakba! Like that, masses of Israelis boycotted the film and canceled their Netflix subscriptions ahead of its release on the platform. Some even called for the film to be removed from Netflix.
They denied that the Nakba happened or that people were killed during the Nakba. Or Haganah soldiers, they were calling them the most moral army and denying this tragedy that happened to my grandparents and many, many people.
Israeli officials said the film's purpose was to incite against Israeli soldiers, and that showing it in an Israeli theater would be a disgrace. Then Finance Minister Avigdor Lieberman also made moves to remove state funding from a theater in Jaffa for screening the film. The attacks against Farha are a normal part of Israel's censorship practices. For decades, the country has suppressed films and documentaries about the Nakba and its army's violence.
They claim that it was a land without people, for people without a land. And I wanted people to know that this land was with people that had lives and heritage and culture and everything.
As a Palestinian, of course, I've heard so many stories about the Nakba and read so much, seen documentaries, but I had never seen anything like this.
One of the audience once told me, even if you read about something or you hear about something, it's different.
One thing clear, Israel has a right to exist and to defend itself. That is an indisputable fact. But so do Palestinians. And that's a fact that's often ignored. Palestinians are, at best, third-class citizens in the nation of their birth. The idea that it's even remotely controversial to call what Israel has imposed on Palestinians a form of apartheid is laughable. One look at a current map of Israel, Gaza, and the occupied territories conjures up only one other example: apartheid-era South Africa. The Israeli government, on an ongoing basis, declares parcels of land on which Palestinians live to be either of military or archaeological importance, causing residents to be evicted. Sometimes there's a court case, and almost always the Palestinians lose. Yet months or weeks later, that same important land suddenly becomes home to a brand new Israeli settlement. As more and more Jewish settlers take over land on which Arabs live, the occupied West Bank becomes de facto more Israeli and, in the explicit hopes of the Israeli government, more Jewish. This is a long-standing attempt and a deliberate attempt to force Arabs who have lived in that land, sometimes for hundreds of years, out. It's an attempt to dilute their presence, because to have Arabs as full participants is, in the opinion of the Israeli government and their courts, diluting Israel. Just prior to the pandemic, I toured many of the contested areas and homes from which Arabs are being pushed out, both in Israel proper and in the occupied territories. Palestinians don't control the important parts of their lives. Palestinian families are refused permits to build or renovate their homes. When they connect their homes to the municipal water supply, Israeli soldiers sometimes cut the pipes. When they attempt to harness solar energy because their homes are not on the grid, Israeli soldiers literally come and remove solar panels from their homes. I spent an hour and a half traveling alongside an elderly Palestinian woman who was being transferred between 3 ambulances from Gaza to the no man's land in between and then into Israel to get cancer treatment. 3 ambulances over the course of 1 mile, more than an hour to cross the border. That's how Gazans live. Without medical treatment because Israel prevents it. Without electricity much of the time because Israel prevents it. Without the ability to fish in the Mediterranean Ocean because Israel prevents it. Without an airport or a seaport because Israel prevents it. Like Israelis, Palestinians also have a right to exist and to defend themselves. But there is no one willing to help them do that. Not the Israeli courts and not the U.S. government. What the U.S. also shares with Israel is the belief that Hamas, the political party that governs Gaza, is a terrorist organization that calls for the destruction of Israel. Hamas is supported by the majority of Palestinians in Gaza. Hamas may not be in the best long-term interests of the Gazans, but peace hasn't really worked out for them. Faced with an Israeli government which pens them into what has been called the world's largest open-air prison, they have chosen a government that most of us wouldn't prefer, one that is not given to negotiation and moderation and respect for its neighbor. Israel needs a new approach to the Palestinians, and America needs a new approach to Israel. After more than 7 decades of not just being deprived of land from which they were evicted, Palestinian frustration runs deep. It may be worth going deeper than what you may hear inside your bubble and understanding the depth to which the Palestinian people are subject to apartheid in their own land, deprived of basic necessities, and subject to relentless civil rights violations. This is not a secret. It's out there for you to see. You just have to look for it.
Back now to our breaking news here in the Middle East. A massive explosion at the largest refugee camp in Gaza. Joining us now is Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hecht. He's the international spokesperson for the Israel Defense Forces. Thanks so much for joining us. I want to ask you first about this massive blast that we all just saw. We saw the video at the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza. Is there anything more you could first of all tell us about how this explosion happened?
Hi Wolf, thanks for having me. So we'll be coming out in the next, hopefully, hour with more data, but I can update you now that there was a very senior Hamas commander in that area. Sadly, he was hiding, again, as they do, behind within civilians, and that's all I can say at this point. We're looking into it and we'll be coming out with more data as we learn what happened there.
So can you confirm it was an Israeli attack that destroyed a big chunk of that Jabalia refugee camp?
Yes, I can. We were focused again on a target, a senior commander, Wolf, and we'll be updating you with more data as the hour moves ahead.
But even if that Hamas commander was there amidst all those Palestinian refugees who are in that Jabalia refugee camp, Israel still went ahead and dropped a bomb there, attempting to kill this Hamas commander, knowing that a lot of innocent civilians, men, women, and children, presumably would be killed. Is that what I'm hearing? knowing that a lot of innocent civilians, men, women, and children, presumably would be killed? Is that what I'm hearing?
That's not what you're hearing, Wolf. We're focused on this commander, again, who you'll get more data who this man was.
It doesn't matter who he was.